about her debut novel, The 7 or 8 Deaths of Stella Fortuna. And she will be signing her books in the book signing tent at the end of this session. And of course, her books are there for purchase in the book sales tent. Thank you so much for staying with us this afternoon. And now I have the pleasure of introducing Dawn Davis. Dawn is the Vice President, Publisher, and Founder of 37 Inc., an imprint within the Atria Publishing Group of Simon & Schuster, which publishes books from a diverse array of cultures and viewpoints. Prior to launching 37 Inc., she was editorial director and then publisher of Amistad Imprint at HarperCollins, where she published the Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, The Known World by Edward P. Jones. Thank you so much, Dawn, for joining us.
Thank you all for coming today to hear Juliet. Can you hear me? Is this on? So I'll give you a little backstory. In our industry, we bid on books. Agents send us novels. They send us proposals. And I actually bid on this book, and I didn't prevail in the auction, but I loved it so very much that when Sue Ellen asked me to help think of authors who would be good for the fair, I was like, well, even though I lost it and I should be bitter, this is so fantastic. I wanted you all to come to know this novel. So let's start with, what's the genesis of the 7 or 8 Deaths of Stella Fortuna?
Well, before we start there, I just want to say what a total badass Dawn Davis is. So I figure you guys probably already know her, but 2 hearts were broken that day. And I'm so happy to be here with you and to have this chance to meet all of you. And I know it's really hot and you could be in a signing line and at one of the many other tents. So thank you for being here. Martha's Vineyard is wonderful. So the 7 or 8 Deaths of Stella Fortuna is a very personal story, which I think every novelist will tell you about every novel they've ever written. In this case, my personal connection to this story goes way, way back. So when I was 5 years old, my grandmother, who I was very close to, had an accident where she sustained a cerebral trauma that was very extreme, and she had a hemorrhage in her brain, and she was rushed to the hospital, and the doctors said, well, she probably won't survive this. The year was 1988. They had an experimental procedure, which is now, I understand, commonly done, where they performed a life-saving lobotomy and to allow her brain to heal. And she survived. And they told us she would be a vegetable for the rest of her life. She would be fed through a feeding tube. She'd be in a wheelchair. She'd never walk or talk again, and she probably wouldn't live very long. The doctors were relentlessly wrong. She lived another 30 years. She passed away last summer at age 98, and we got to have her for that whole length of time. And I should mention, we're an Italian family. We're very tight-knit. My mother has a bajillion brothers. I have many cousins, so we were all very, it was really important to us to have had our matriarch for that long, and we were really grateful. But also, she had been lobotomized, so she was not the matriarch she had been before this trauma, and kind of those last 30 years were childlike, and they required constant medical care. She had one of her sons ended up devoting his life to being her caretaker. He never married or had children, and you know, we all kind of revolved around her, but we never knew what was coming next. There were some funny times. She would go around the neighborhood distributing gifts to people. She was a very loving woman. The gifts might be Mardi Gras beads. They might be crocheted bookmarks that she made. They might be small sticks of deodorant. Some mixed messages, but you know, she was lobotomized, so you know, and as a kid I was like, oh, everyone has a crazy grandma, you know, and she would only wear red after her accident, and she would get confused about what had happened on TV versus what had happened in real life. So some of the things that had changed were funny, and then some of them were really, really not funny. And the most unfunny thing that happened to my family was that she had a sister who was 1 year younger than her. They had grown up as best friends. They had married best friends. friends. They had bought 2 plots of land right next door to each other that overlooked the same backyard. My great aunt had not been able to have children, and my grandmother had way too many children. So they had raised these kids together. So really, my mom and her generation looked to my great aunt as their other mother. And when she woke up from her coma, for reasons she was never able to explain to anyone, she would not speak to her sister ever again. And they were together their entire lives, including for 30 years of this violent, bitter blood feud that we just never were able to understand. And she only passed away a couple months ago. So it was like as soon as my grandmother died, she couldn't go on living. And she spent the last 30 years of her life asking us all the time, like, what did I do wrong? I mean, she was heartbroken. She had lost her best friend. She had also been separated from the family she had raised, because as much as we loved her and revered her, she wasn't the matriarch. And it just, for me, that became this really provocative point. I was 5 when it happened. I think I was the right age to remember who my grandmother had been beforehand, whereas all the other cousins were younger than me and they couldn't remember. And I was horrified by watching what happened to my aunt in her old age, having to live alone, separated from her best friend and sister. After they're widowed, they're living together and totally apart. And I wanted to capture my aunt's story and dignify it, because she didn't have that family to pass on her legacy. And I wanted to try to explain what her heartbreak was. And so I started trying to write it when I was just a little girl. And then as I got older, I understood there was this second tragedy that was my grandmother's, because she was constantly in need of medical care. She was a burden to her family, although we loved and revered her. I noticed that the memories of who she had been when she was an integer and a matriarch, and this woman who had sacrificed so much to keep her family together, all of those good memories had been eroded. And instead, people were remembering how she was difficult, how she had struggled with alcoholism, how she had not been the best mother. And I started to ask, why did this last accident happen? What are we not talking about? And now this woman who can't tell her own story, how can we restore her legacy and the dignity to that legacy? Because I think that there's something critically misunderstood here. I'm going to figure out what it is.
So is this a blend of, it's a novel, we call it a novel, but it sounds like it's also autobiographical. So how did you decide, instead of writing a memoir, you were going to write a novel?
Well, Dawn, this book is a work of fiction, and any resemblance to persons living or dead is strictly coincidental. Are there any lawyers in the audience? So I think one of the big problems was I tried to write this many times from the time I was a little girl. I really wanted to write this story about my grandmother and her sister. And I struggled, and I hit wall after wall. And the last serious attempt I made was in 2010 and 2011. And I sat down and I wrote 60,000 words of a biography of my grandmother. And I hated it so much. It felt stale and boring. And I was like, she's had a very interesting life. I'm not doing it justice. So I threw it away. And finally, what set me free to finish the book was realizing that because of the lobotomy, I didn't understand my grandmother's character. I could never understand why she made the choices she made, and if I tried to pretend I did, I was never going to get there. So instead, I invented this fictional character of Stella Fortuna, who could follow some of her footsteps, who could come from the place she came from, and who could say some of the things that I had discovered about her generation, about immigrants coming to the States in the 20s and 30s, and about how women suffered under the extreme patriarchy that existed in southern Italy and other parts of Europe at this time, and the world. But that really I needed to make up a completely fictitious Stella. So I think bits and pieces of this have come from oral histories that I've collected and book research and family history, but really Stella is entirely a work of fiction. Stella herself.
Let me ask you, how many people in the audience read the Ferrante novels and just digested and devoured them? So are you influenced by Ferrante, and were you able to maybe you were able to turn to fiction because Ferrante put it out in the world and you were able to see the through line?
I actually didn't read the Ferrante novels until the summer of 2016, so I was done with my draft of this book. So I was not influenced by her, but I was inspired by her because I saw so much. I thought this story was too small and specific, and I thought people aren't going to be interested in the hardships in this one village, right? And she showed me that actually, when you have a very powerful and interesting character,
Right.
that can be a lens for people to want to experience something that is quite different from their own background. And those novels are great, so if you haven't read them, you should read them. They're so
They're
addictive.
fantastic.
Wow.
I want to talk a little bit about Calabria. I know that I'm an Italophile, and before children, I used to go every year. And I remember one time trying to go to Calabria, and I was staying at some fancy hotel, and the concierge said, "May I ask you why Calabria? There's so many beautiful places in Italy that you can go." And so I think it's interesting for us to even, to set the novel in a Calabrian village. And let me just read a little bit. You say, Calabria is a land of improbable mountaintop towns. Their streets so steep that to walk up them is to nearly crawl on one's hands and knees. The Calabresi built these inaccessible villages defensively. For 2,000 years, Calabria was besieged by Romans who stripped away all of their timber, Byzantines who made the whole region Orthodox, North Africans who made it Muslim, castle-building Normans who made it Catholic, Bourbons, Habsburgs, and finally Italians. So it's this mysterious place. Did you have to do a lot of research to figure out how to really bring it alive? Because you really do bring it alive.
Oh, thank you. So the experience about the concierge telling you why are you going to Calabria, this happens all the time. And before I started the research, it makes my blood boil because I think people like my mom, who's a first-generation American, grew up thinking that the place that her family was from was a shithole, if you'll excuse my language, and she was never proud of it, and she thought she had no cultural legacy to ever lean on. So if there's one, well, if there are 5 things I want to evangelize with this novel, one of them is certainly Calabria and the Italian South, which is vastly misunderstood. So first I'm going to tell you that it has this great 3,000-year history. If you've read the Odyssey, do you remember when Odysseus washes up and Nausicaa, the princess, comes and rescues him, right? This happens in Tropea, which is a beach city on the Tyrrhenian coast of Calabria. At this point, Calabria is part of Magna Graecia. Pythagoras was born there. I mean, all of these famous Greek sailors and philosophers and mathematicians. So it has this very rich intellectual culture that goes way, way back. And the name Calabria itself is from Greek, and Calabria means fertile land. So what happens is it's so fertile, everyone wants to live there. The timber is so rich, the fish are so plentiful, the mountains are so full of swine and mushrooms and delicious food, and so you get wave after wave of conqueror who's coming in. They want to colonialize, they want to strip away the resources, they have no interest in the people except maybe a lascivious interest, which leads us to being a very ethnically and racially mixed group of people with interesting linguistic cultures as well. But also what happens in these hill towns is we have this, has anyone ever heard of the evil eye? Yeah, okay, all right. So we have this belief in the evil eye, or the Maloch in Calabrese, which is this miasma born of the jealousy of others around us. Sometimes people who want what we have, and sometimes people who love us and don't realize that they're jealous of what we have. And what happens is these suppressed resentments kind of go up into the air and they strike us down when we have good things. So Calabrese and other southern Italians, but especially Calabrese, they try to hide their riches, right? If you are about to get married, you're in a point of danger. If you're about to have a baby, if you are unusually long-lived and you've had a very healthy life, if you have any kind of riches, if you have too many goats, I mean, whatever the thing is that may make you a target of your neighbor's jealousy, you lie about it, you hide it, and you do some very standard kind of witch work to prevent the curse from falling on you. And I think all of this fear of jealousy is a result of having had this wealth that everyone else has been feasting on for 3,000 years, right? So that's, I mean, the evil eye is such a very provocative theme for me. And in the story, it's this thing that I think can come even between best friends and family members, if you're worried that someone is jealous of what you have, right? But
and certainly Stella is thought to be under the evil eye because she has
cursed.
these 7 or 8 deaths.
Right.
But you talk about a time of abundance,
Yes.
but it was really poverty. I think there's a line in the novel where 17 boys from her village leave to go to the war with Austria, and then wave after wave of just really the decimation of the male population, either fleeing, to America for a better life, or for wars. And so, while this is certainly a story about patriarchy and about Stella, who's this character you will never forget, I was reminded in this time it's also an immigrant story. Like, what makes people leave are these kind of extremes. And so while you were researching it, to what extent in your mind was it an immigrant story versus a woman's story, or did the lines get blurred for you?
So it was so much both of those. I said maybe my 5 axes I had to grind. Those are 2 more of them about what women did in this time when women were left behind, and also about the immigrant experience for men and for women, especially from in the 19-teens and 20s, Italians were a very unfavorable race. There was a study done by the Boston Globe in 1911, and I don't remember the exact title, but it was along the lines of, is the Italian personality more criminal than any other? And the answer was yes. And this study was leaned on in order to establish the Immigration and Naturalization Act in 1921, 24, 26, that then instituted quotas and limited who could come into this country, which frankly
Sound familiar?
Yes, it is the blueprint of why we are having these dialogues today. And what we don't acknowledge is that our ancestors were let in without the restrictions that current immigrants and refugees face. But anyway, that's a side story. So the problem with the Italian criminality, for me, comes down to colonialism. And in the north of Italy, where you had this free culture that was allowed to rule itself and establish universities and, art and all of these things we love to visit in Venice and Florence. And the South was living under this yoke of Spanish colonialism for 600 years. The last 400 years being so extreme. It was really sharecropping or even slavery. Because people couldn't own land, women weren't citizens at all. Everything was controlled either by the church or by absentee barons, and you were every year owing more to your landlord in order to be able to farm that land than you could possibly earn from it. And if your children had malaria, you had no money to get them money. So when Italy unifies in the 1850s and 60s, suddenly these Southerners who have been maligned by, no one has ever had any respect for them because they say it's a point of no culture because their culture has been stripped away from them for 600 years. Suddenly they have passports. Meanwhile, America is going through its own labor crisis because we have had our Civil War and we can no longer rely on the unpaid labor of African Americans. So suddenly what we need is really cheap labor from elsewhere, right? So guess what happens? There's a need, there's another need, they meet each other. All of these poor and uneducated Southern Italians come in here, they fill that gap, and they undergo such incredible hardship and heroism, and the things that they did to give us the lives we have are incredible. The flip side of that is that the villages that they left behind have been emptied out. So these really beautiful and ancient places with this fascinating multicultural legacy, they're just, there's no one left there.
Oh, it's so true.
And it's a story I wanted to tell about all of the immigrants in those first waves were male because they were the ones who could get the work visas. So that leaves behind people like Assunta, Stella's mom, with her children who have, Assunta is not a citizen, so she can't own land, she can't buy her own house, she can't work a job for money, and she has all these children to take care of.
We're trying, we heard a couple people say no spoilers, so we want to give you the arc, but not give you the arc.
I'm not going to tell you any.
So Stella is from this decimated village. She marries and is forced to immigrate. I think that's not giving away too much. But for all of the decimation that she leaves, there was also so much beauty in
Yes.
Calabria. And
Yeah.
I want to put you on the spot. I
No,
want to
no,
ask if you will
please.
sing a Calabrian song for us.
Oh, yeah.
That kind of can
Sure.
show us, because in these places of kind of destruction, there's still beauty, right?
Well, I think, so what happened when I was trying to bring Calabria alive, because I'm very proud of this beautiful place and all of its layers of culture, but one of the functions of colonialism is there's not really room for education for kids, right? They're going to work when they're 6 years old. So when I was going to Calabria and interviewing octogenarians and nonagenarians who remembered the 20s and 30s, a lot of them cannot read and write. There are no books that I could lean on. So I had to go for other historical records, and one of the big tells is folk music, which has carried on. It captures the language, it captures the milieu, and I think I personally was always listening to Calabria's folk music as I was writing this to kind of get in the right mood. But there's only one song that made it into the text, so I'll sing that one for you, if that's okay.
Can she sing for us?
Is that all right? So I call this the Calabrese national anthem in the diaspora. It's called Calabrisella Mia. Does anyone speak Italian? Okay. So it's in the Calabrese dialect, so it's different anyway, but that means my Calabrese girl. And it's about a man who falls in love with a beautiful village girl with dark eyes, and he sees her, she's hanging laundry, and he steals her most beautiful handkerchief. That's like a sign of romance, right? But then he goes away. In the song, he goes away to go study in the city. And when he comes home, he finds that she's left him for another man. But for me, I think this song became so powerful to the diaspora because it was a symbol of immigration. The men having to go away and coming home. The Calabrisella is not the girl, but the land itself that has moved on without them. And they no longer fit in. They're now American. And, and the clash of culture is there. So we've really kept it alive, and everyone sings it. And so I just told you the plot of the first verse. I'll sing it for you now. It goes, Ni natividad l'acqua chi lavavi, e lume cori si inchiuda muri, mentre li bagna la si palampravi, iuta rubai lume giunucaturi. Calabrisella mia, Calabrisella mia, Calabrisella mia, facimmo muri. Tira lula 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 la, sta Calabrisella muriri mi fa. Wow.
That was beautiful.
So in my book, the suitors always try to sing this to the beautiful Calabrisella girls.
Beautiful.
And they always have other stuff going on, so they rebuff them. So
I want to talk about another part of Calabrese culture. We were on a panel yesterday with Ruth Reichel and a couple of other books that had food that was central to those particular books. And in this book, the women, and part of being is part of the culture, but also part of the patriarchy, is they were always expected to breed, to cook, to clean. And there's a scene when Stella's husband goes to war, and he comes back and she thinks he's after his nap, I have to cook for him. But the village has been so decimated, there's no flour for bread. And she's thinking, how can I make a soup? And she uses, I think, dried soup and dried fruit. So food, and by the way, I did make it to Calabria. Even though the concierge said don't go, I did go. I went to Tropea, and it was amazing. It was so beautiful. And the food was distinct and delicious. Still very much Italian, lots of pasta. But talk to me about the food, and I hope the research involved lots of eating.
oh yeah, oh well, I mean, it would have been irresponsible if it hadn't, don't you think, Dawn? So this is another point of contact with an illiterate generation, especially women, and collecting women's stories. Food is transmission of information, both the recipe, because it illuminates how you spend the year, the holy festivals that define you, how you source things that you can eat. I like the things that you eat during Lent are also the things that are available in February, which is difficult in a mountain village, right? So for me, food research was a vital part of understanding how life worked. But the other thing that it did was it opened doors to me to get people to talk. So I took my little tape recorder or my video recorder. I would go and I'd meet with a Nona or a Zia, and they would show me how to make their cookies, and then that would be a way for us to conduct an interview about their immigrant experience, about the village that they remembered, about their lost mother or aunt or her story, and so it was both my access point to figuring out how to tell this story, but it was also ended up becoming a big part of the story. Because I think if you're a Sunta and your husband's away at war and you've got 4 kids or whatever to raise on your own, sourcing food is such a big part of your day. So that was fascinating. And I also found, as you mentioned, the cuisine is distinct. And it's very, so of all those layers of conquerors who have been part of Calabria, they've left different impressions. So it was under Arab rule for between 300 and 500 years, depending on what part of Calabria you're in. And the Arabs introduced some really important chili peppers. The Calabrese love spicy food. It is so delicious. They also introduced eggplants from Sicily, so you get all of these really delicious. Now, meanwhile, the Arabs, they did not eat pork because that's a dirty meat for them. But then we were under Greek rule for so long, and the Greeks brought this sausage curing techniques and the wine harvesting that takes over in the foothills. So basically, what you've got is, I think, the best of all of the worlds, and it's a really great cuisine. And I did put together a bunch of recipes taken from the book, which are on my website. So if you want to look at cooking some of those, they're there. But there's a lot of pasta, as you mentioned, a lot of
spicy. It was very delicious.
Yeah.
So it sounds like sometimes the way to get people to reveal their family secrets was to talk about food. There are a lot of secrets in this novel. Tolstoy says all happy families are the same, but unhappy families are their own thing. And you have a kind of similar thing about families keeping their secrets. Read it to us in Italian and then tell us what is the central secret in this novel without giving it away.
Yes,
without
no
the
spoilers. So Dawn's referencing, I have a lot of proverbs that I put throughout the book, which was another great point of entry, I think, for history. But there's one, igual da piñata si sapa solo a chi chiara che ci vuota, which means the problems inside the pot are known only by the spoon that stirs it. Yes, which is a metaphor for basically the problems inside a family are only known inside the family. So don't judge other people because you don't know what's going on in there, right? But I did find a companion proverb. I don't remember the Italian right now, but it is basically, if you want to know the secrets of a family, ask the children. And this is the thing I love about the Calabrese in general. They're totally capable of cognitive dissonance. So you can't know any of the secrets, but if you want to know the secrets, ask the children. So I think I'm the children in this scenario. So I think what happened over and over when I was conducting these interviews was I realized that women want to be thought of a certain way as good Christian women. And you're a wife and you're a mother, and that's the form with which you are a successful woman. And if you scratch the surface on that just a little bit, you get the problems. Like people like my aunt who could never have children. And in the Catholic dialogue, God blesses you with children if you're a good Christian woman. So there's always a little bit of a stigma if you're like my aunt and cannot have children. And the pain of that becomes a problem everywhere throughout the family. And there are many related conversations about what women should have said about them, what they're hiding that they've suffered personally to persevere in this myth of the good woman, and also what they've hidden to keep their families together. And that is what I wanted to talk about. I wanted to get to what women do that is heroic, that has been lost because it's thought of as unattractive.
Stella rejects so much of what's expected of her. And I guess my question is, she's expected to get married. She doesn't want to get married. She's expected to have children. She doesn't initially want to have children. She's expected to go along with the program that her husband, and she fights it tooth and nail. Is that kind of patriarchy? Well, two questions. Is that specific to Calabrese culture, to Italian culture, to Old World culture in general, or what do you think? Is that something? Where do you draw the lines on that? Is that all?
One of my early pieces of research was to go to Ellis Island because I thought, my family hadn't come in through there, but I should see it, right? Because I got to understand immigration history. And wouldn't you know, on the boat that day, there was an Italian tourist family. And they were from the Veneto. And I sat down and I was just learning Italian again. So I was trying to, talk to this lady in Italian. And she's like, "Oh, you are Italian. Where's your family from?" And I said, "Oh, they're from Calabria." And she goes, "Oh, the Calabrese, they're very stubborn. That is what the Calabrese are. They're very stubborn. Where's your husband's family from?" And I was like, "Well, they're from Genoa." And she goes, "Oh, Genoa, they're very cheap." And then she proceeds to go through every region of Italy and tell me the stereotype about that region of Italy, and she definitely told me people from the Veneto were the best. They were good people. But I thought I love Venetians. So, but I thought that was amazing that throughout Italy the Calabrese are known for being stubborn. In Italian you say testa dura, it means hard head, and in Calabrese we say gabadost because we celebrate it too. So is that specifically Calabrese? I'll say yeah, we're stubborn, but when life is tough, if you're tough back, then you get things done, right? And I think Stella, my grandmother was tough as hell. She was so stubborn, and sometimes you just didn't understand why. And I always thought that was interesting. Why fight for something after a point that you realize it's not what you want anymore? But you got to stand your ground, because when you got nothing else, you have to stand your ground.
Do you want to read from the novel a little bit, or do you want to? What do you guys? Do you want to read from her? Do you want to hear her?
Okay, so I'm gonna tell you.
It comes with a warning.
It comes with a warning. So I only do one reading from this book. I told Dawn it's 10 minutes long, so it's a bit long. It was also picked by my 89-year-old grandmother, who said, if you're ever going to, on the other side of the family, if you're ever going to read, you have to read this. But it contains some very foul language.
Well, I don't know if we have 10 minutes.
Okay.
We want to take questions as well.
Okay, well then no, we shouldn't do it.
Why don't we open it up to questions then? Does anyone have any questions? Oh, sorry.
The question is, what is the passage, so you can read it to yourselves later. It is page 276. And if you want, you can read it at the I feel it doesn't have any spoilers in it, so, or not that many spoilers, so.
Hi, I love the book, and I read in your bio that you worked at Soho Press.
Yes.
So now that you've helped publish, and now that you have been published, how has those two processes helped? How's it been on both sides?
That is a great question, and before we started this conversation, I asked the same exact question.
It's been really weird. It's been very strange. I've been an editor for a very long time, and I have told many authors, I've given them suggestions on how to make their books better, and I've had a lot of authors be like, "Oh, thank you so much for your suggestions," and I've had a lot of other authors be like, "This is why you're wrong, and you clearly don't understand me." And so going into this, I vowed I was going to be a column A author, and I really leaned hard on my experience as an editor to try to be a well-behaved author, because I've seen a lot of bad author behavior. But only my editor would be able to tell you if I succeeded or not. You'll have to ask her, and then please don't tell me the answer. But I will say that my advantage being an editor was going into this writing when I finished my draft of this book and wanted so desperately to share it. I knew that I was only 20% of the way ready to sharing it, and then I spent another 4 years editing it before I sent it to any agents. And I think that is why it was able to be published. And I think, so if I'm giving any two-sided advice to any aspiring authors, it is just have the stamina for editing and just keep going until you're so sick of the book you can't stand it anymore.
It was well received in the industry. Let me ask, as we get someone coming to the mic, how did your family receive the novel? Did they feel more pride for their Calabrese culture? Did they feel like you were divulging family secrets? What happened?
I was so nervous about that because I wasn't sure if they were going to be upset by the depiction of this woman inspired by my grandmother, who is not my grandmother, and and they've been so supportive and warm. And I think my uncle has bought more copies than anyone. I think he's bought like 35 copies or something. He just keeps buying them and giving them to straight. He's like the way my grandmother used to give out deodorant. He's giving out copies of Stella Fortuna.
I just love it
So-
because Stella is such a complicated figure. You know, she just pushes against everything, and you just root for her. And there are no easy solutions. And you don't hand us a kind of nice, compact story where everything, you know, she's complicated. Looks like we have another question.
Yeah, hi. I love your writing. And I know your grandmother's passed. I hope there are other people going to inspire you to come up with some more stories.
Oh, don't worry.
Yeah, good.
She's working on another novel, indeed.
All right, excellent. Yeah, I'm sucked right in. So, the evil eye, we have that in my Portuguese culture and Brazilian culture, and we wear the little figurines to keep it away. Do you have such a thing? And a symbol
Do you mean
that
like
you...
this?
Is it a fist with a...
So no, this is
thumb in here?
This is a little weird looking. You may have seen Italians wearing what looks like a small pepper. Which we call a cornetto in Italian, which means little horn, or cornigio in Calabrese. And the idea is, or if you see someone doing this, it's the same. It's the horns to pierce the evil eye, right? And this is a confusing gesture because it means both to protect you from the evil eye or to curse you, or say you're evil, you're bringing the evil eye down on people. So, you know, you'll never know. If someone goes up to you like this, they may be protecting you or they may be cursing you. And again, cognitive dissonance, right? Maybe both. So I'm going to tell you a dirty story now because I didn't tell you one before. So everywhere I go, people are like, what's your necklace? Is that a J for Juliet? And I say, no, actually, it's an evil eye. It's just unusually large. Usually they're these little gold horns. But when Calabrese see it, they say, oh, that is such a beautiful cornigilo. And when I brought it to my my then 94-year-old, my husband bought me this when I started my research, my 94-year-old great aunt, she says to me, oh, your husband, he give you a really big one.
Can't take these Calabrese anywhere.
No, nowhere at all.
Anyone else with any questions? Well, Juliet, you have been so delightful. If you haven't read this book, it really is such an old-fashioned story that sucks you right in, and you know, you learn so much. I learned a lot about the decimation that the two wars caused Italy. I mean, I knew it in my head. And funny fact, I don't even know if Sue Ellen, who knows everything, knows this. My grandmother is Calabrian as well, so I felt a particular
We've established
kinship.
that we're
Yes, we
third
think we're
cousins.
cousins. Yes, exactly.
Yes.
But anyway, thank you all for coming out on such a
Thank
warm
you all so much.
And please